Gender-based violence advocacy group has stressed the urgent need for police and the justice system to educate and support complainants on how to use protection orders correctly. The TS Foundation warns that without clear guidance on reporting breaches and engaging with police, protection orders offer little real protection. Well, this call comes amid growing concern over the effectiveness of such orders following the recent murder of two women who reportedly had protection orders in place. In a significant development, a parolee with a known history of violence towards his ex-girlfriend has been sentenced to 10 years in prison. The case finalized this week relates to an incident on September 20th last year, just 3 days after Luzizo Manjo was released on parole. Now, to unpack this further, we speak to Lisa Vetten, researcher and GBV activist. Lisa, thanks for your time this morning. A very sensitive conversation, especially as we wrap up Women's Month. And I think the first question would have to be, do protection orders actually work? Do they protect?
It would appear so. And I'll give you some data to indicate that, but I don't think that means we should not ignore these incredibly serious cases when a murder does happen. And it would appear to be as a result of the police's somewhat lackadaisical attitude, will be kind, towards enforcing the order. So we have figures for 2009, which suggest that about 1 in 20 women who were murdered that year by their partners had a protection order at the time. And then we have data from 2017, which puts it down at about 2%. Now, the big question we could ask is why possibly more women who died at the hands of their intimate partners and who had a history of domestic violence didn't have a protection order, which may have protected them. But we also need to ask the question as to why did those women die? The purpose of a protection order is to protect you and to prevent further violence. And when it doesn't do that, it's incredibly serious. We have to rule out, was there police negligence, in which case very serious consequences must flow, or is this case telling us about an incredibly dangerous individual, and what can we learn from this case to ensure that this never ever happens again? What additional protections do we need to build in?
Yeah, and I think you asked the right question there. I mean, if the data is showing that they should generally work, you know, why are women still being killed, finding protection orders in their handbag? What is failing? Is it the law enforcement or is it both?
Well, I can tell you of another case in 2022 where this particular individual had his ex-girlfriend had applied for a protection order against him and had asked for his firearm to be removed. The police never even served the protection order, and they scratched out the instruction to remove the firearm. In 2022, he killed his other girlfriend. She had also obtained a protection order against him that also asked for his firearm to be removed. And although they served the protection order, they never removed the firearm. And that was what he killed her with. And in that particular case, the police officer who didn't remove the firearm was disciplined, but the sanction, and I think this goes to the point that Tears was making, was laughable. She was suspended for 2 months without pay, despite her actions resulting in somebody's loss of life. So that's a very clear case. Some of these cases you're talking about could also be examples of the police failing to follow up. But there have been some, I think, with men who stalk and who hide, you know, and they're very hard to trace. Those are slightly different, they're more difficult to deal with. I think the other thing that we don't know that needs to be in effect, and as far as I know is not yet in effect, is that the amendments to protection order introduced what's called a safety monitoring notice. And it was specifically intended for high-risk cases. And what the court should do if they give one to a woman is it instructs the police to follow up on her regularly, on her safety, whether that is through WhatsApp messages, telephone calls, going past the house to check that she is safe. So those are the kinds of orders we need in these very high-risk cases. But the last I'd heard from the Department of Justice in last year's annual report was that they'd only really tested the safety monitoring notice at one station. So it's not available everywhere yet.
Yeah, and I think how different is this from the parole crisis? For example, we know that there are many people on parole that often reoffend, and just in this case, many that have these protection orders out against them, still harassing some of those victims, in some cases even leading to the point where they are being killed. What is the responsibility that needs to take place in terms of risk management, in terms of monitoring as well, how these protection orders are issued?
I mean, you raise a very important point about parole. The questions you want to ask in relation to parole are, was the woman concerned informed that he was about to be released? Was she invited to any kind of parole hearing where she could put forward what she thought about his being released? And I strongly suspect she wasn't. What steps did the parole board take, I think, in assessing his risk as to whether or not he still posed a risk to her? Because again, I'm wondering if they even did that kind of investigation. And was the protection order still in place? Had she been informed? What backup plans were there for her? Should he come out and threaten her? So it sounds like all those steps were skipped. And I'm sure it's not just in this case, but it ought to be a general principle in all parole matters as to whether or not somebody is safe. And I mean, the other area that should also be looked at. Go ahead.
No, please continue.
There is also one other order, and this is a case where somebody has laid criminal charges but doesn't have a protection order. There, the courts are supposed to, even if somebody hasn't asked for a protection order, they're supposed to intervene and order a hearing in order to determine whether or not she needs a protection order. So those are two additional safety mechanisms that it doesn't sound like they're being put into effect as they should be.
And you list a couple of questions there in terms of, the woman, whether or not they were told if the parolee was going to be released. But the reality is a lot of this is the burden of the victim, especially even when it comes to protection orders. It's that it has to be the victim that has to go and report these issues. It's the victim that has to ensure that they are in a place of safety. I mean, how fair is this, and what more really needs to be done to strengthen at least the monitoring and ensuring that victims don't have to carry the burden?
Yes, that's a very important word you used, burden, because I think it becomes such a burden that victims tend to give up. There are quite a lot of things that need to be done. If we start at the level of the police, I think that the issue of training is very important. I think that the way in which the police enforce protection orders also needs to become part of their performance. So we need to be looking at we need to be looking at this when we look at particular stations. We should be looking at the performance of a station commander in relation to the protection order. Do they comply with each and every single requirement in the Act? Because the Act has placed quite a lot of duties on the police to enforce protection orders, the records they should keep, whether they're taking disciplinary action against officers who fail to comply with their orders, like not removing firearms, for example. So I think that's one component that we need to look at. We also need to look at the resourcing of the courts. Thanks to fiscal austerity, we don't have enough clerks. So too few clerks means they rush through the service. They don't necessarily explain everything to women. Which means that women don't always leave understanding how the protection order works. Some of them won't even know that they have to actually come back, and that there has to be a final hearing, and that if they don't come back on that date, there's a risk. It happens, it should not happen, but there is a risk that the magistrate will then strike the matter off the roll and the protection order will become redundant. So that's the court side. The courts also don't routinely refer to shelters when they should. They will pick up very high-risk cases. We also don't always have, it ought to be mandatory, for example, for magistrates to ask women if men have guns, and to automatically ask for their removal. That's not happening. You can sometimes even have situations where women mention guns and don't ask for them to be removed. And again, the magistrate should be proactive and ask for the firearm to be removed. And then as another step, there need to be shelters available for women. In Gauteng, for example, we've seen the number of shelters almost halve, and you can see that in the number of women and children who obtained protection. We had 2,400 obtaining protection in shelters. In 2023-24, that number dropped to 1,200 in 2024-2025. And only because the department had been closing shelters as a result of a range of, again, administrative burdens placed on shelters, not because the shelters had done any harm to women. So our systems of support and protection are not working to back up the potential power of the protection order.
And I think as well, when you talk about a protection order and the questions that need to be asked, many women often find themselves in the point where it's perhaps too late. What kind of situation, whether it is a difficult one or whether it is something that could potentially be dangerous, what type of situation should people find themselves in that says, right, I have every right to take out a protection order. Can you walk us through, perhaps for someone out there who just doesn't know, does this situation require a protection order? Because we often find that in some cases it becomes just a bit too late.
Yes. Look, I think it would seem, and the risk, and this appears to be an international pattern, that when women want to end relationships, they have decided they've had enough, they can't take it, they just cannot take it anymore. But that is a very high risk period for women. So I think if that's the point at which they start to leave, at which they leave, their family and friends need to really pay particular attention to their safety. Do not tell women to give him one last chance or to just speak to him because he is so desperate. And I mean, you will often find his family also contacting her saying, please just see him one last time. He wants to apologize. He wants to see you. That is a no-no, I would say. The data just tells us that that is just too high risk for women. I think a partner who, if you have left, who is stalking you, constantly SMS, constantly messaging you, constantly phoning you, getting his friends to phone you, coming to your workplace, following you home, sitting outside your house, waiting for you to leave. Anybody who's displaying that behavior is really, I think, very high risk. But I think you are entitled to protection order if you've ever been physically assaulted in any way. If you are being belittled, humiliated, run down, told what a rubbish you are, we always, I think, underestimate emotional abuse and psychological abuse. It is very harmful, and it often can go with domestic. It can often go with go with physical violence, and sometimes what happens in relationships can look. I'll use the word small without wanting to suggest that domestic violence is small, but small incident. But when you must never look at just one incident in a relationship. You must look at all of them together. What is the pattern here? Is there lots of ongoing emotional abuse, lots of stalking, lots of running down, lots of breaking down? Perhaps what looks like the odd small slap. When you look at that totality, the totality of what's going on there, it is so controlling, so coercive, that that woman lives in fear. She does nothing unless he has said, you do so first. She has been gaslit to the point where she asks and questions every single thing she does. Her entire life has been reduced to keeping this man happy so that he is not abusive towards her. I think, again, those situations, from an outsider, it might not look very much, but again, you've got to look at the totality of what's going on in the relationship, not does he slap her or doesn't he? That's not the test, I think, for whether or not you go and get a protection order.
Yeah, and while we are speaking about the fact on educating women out there in regards to protection orders, just also as we wrap, what measures to take if a protection order has been violated?
The first thing that you need to do is to call the police. They, again, depending on the circumstances, they do have some discretion. He can be arrested immediately, or they will give him a notice to appear in court. I would suggest that at that point, somebody insists that his firearm, if his firearm hasn't been removed, it absolutely must be removed. It must be checked. It must be checked. If you are concerned about your safety, if he has been issuing threats to you, if he has been stalking you, it might also be worth going to a shelter for a couple of days or to a family member just to be aware. But immediately inform the police. If they don't arrest him, think of other steps you can take if you fear for your safety. He should then appear in court in order to be charged with contempt of court, not assault GBH, but contempt of court because he's ignored a court order. And if he has been shown to have violated, you can have as it happened in this other case, somebody can obviously they can go to jail, or they can be given a suspended sentence or other options. But you can also, I think it's important that you speak to the prosecutor and tell them what you want to have happen, and make sure that they know everything that has happened to you so that they can bring full evidence before the court in order to ensure that this person is properly dealt with.
Yeah. A very crucial conversation there in regards to protection orders, specifically at a time when we wrap up Women's Month, a look to see whether or not protection orders are a symbolic piece of paper or truly do they shield women